If you have ever been caught in a riptide at the beach, um, you know the absolute visceral terror of it. You are just swimming along, the water is fine, the sun is out, and suddenly you feel this massive, invisible hand pulling you out into the open ocean. It is
Oh,
terrifying.
yeah. It really is. It is pure panic.
Right. And the immediate human instinct, like the thing every fiber of your being screams at you to do, is to fight. You turn your body toward the shore, you put your head down, and you swim against that current with every single ounce of strength you possess.
Which is, tragically, the absolute worst thing you can possibly do in that scenario.
The lifeguards will tell you it is fighting the riptide directly that actually kills people. Your own panicked willpower leads to total muscle failure. You exhaust yourself, your lungs give out, and you drown.
Yeah, the ocean always wins that fight.
Exactly. The only way to survive a riptide is to stop fighting the current head-on. You either have to swim parallel to the shore or you just float. You literally let the current carry you out until it weakens, and then you use the ocean's own mechanics to safely make your way back to a sandbar.
But that requires an incredibly counterintuitive surrender. I mean, you are essentially acting against your most primal survival instincts. You have to let go of the illusion that your own strength is going to save you.
And that counterintuitive reality that letting go of your own strength is the only way to survive is exactly where we are going today. Welcome to Reformed Thinking. Today's deep dive is going to completely upend our natural
It
instincts.
really is. We are tackling some heavy concepts today.
We are. Our mission here is to totally reframe how you, the listener, view your own personal weaknesses, your suffering, and especially those secret recurring temptations that you just can't seem to beat. We are working through a pair of incredibly rich theological essays today, looking at the journey from fiery trials to heavenly thrones and from temptation to triumph.
These concepts are profoundly challenging, but they offer an absolute lifeline. Because if you are listening to this and you feel stuck in an exhausting cycle of relying on sheer willpower to fight a specific sin and you just keep failing, we want to offer a radical paradigm shift.
What if your most intense moments of temptation aren't actually signs of impending defeat? What if they are a divine summons?
Right. What if they are an invitation?
Exactly. What if you could take the very impulses that are designed to destroy your life and use them as weapons to do massive damage to the enemy's kingdom?
To understand how that is even possible, we have to establish a foundational worldview. We have to move completely away from the way modern evangelicalism typically handles human struggle.
Which is usually just a lot of pragmatism.
Oh, entirely. If you look around the professing church today, there is a massive reliance on worldly pragmatism. It is all about psychological self-help, mystical experiences, or a subtle prosperity theology. It essentially says, if you just have enough faith, if you pray the right formula, you will never struggle again.
It is the idea that the Christian life is supposed to be this unbroken streak of earthly victories, perfect emotional health, and financial stability. And if you aren't experiencing that, well, you must be doing something wrong. You need a better app, a better morning routine, or a 5-step plan to overcome your anxiety.
A new podcast or a new journal. But that entire framework is built on a very fragile foundation of human capability.
Yeah.
Today, we are anchoring entirely in the absolute sovereignty of God.
Which changes everything.
It does. We are looking through a theological lens where human bankruptcy, total devastating insufficiency, is not the end of the story. It is the exact theater that God intentionally designs for divine grace to operate.
I want to spend some time on that phrase, human bankruptcy, because the root problem of the modern Christian experience seems to be this arrogant self-sufficiency.
Absolutely. We hate being bankrupt.
We do. We have so much access to information and technology that we trick ourselves into believing we can manage our own spiritual lives. And the result is a systemic surrender to secret temptation, which is masked by a completely prayerless life.
And prayerlessness isn't just a minor scheduling issue, is it?
No, not at all.
It is not just forgetting to do your devotions. Prayerlessness is a theological statement. It is a declaration of independence from God. It is practical atheism.
Wow. Practical atheism. That is heavy.
It is heavy, but it is true. When we do not pray, we're looking at the universe and saying, I can handle this on my own. I have the resources within myself to survive. And God, in his absolute mercy, actively works to dismantle that self-reliance. He will use profound affliction to break it down.
Let's look at how God does that practically. Let's travel back to AD 55 or 56 and look at the Apostle Paul, specifically his second letter to the Corinthians, chapter 1. The church in Corinth was dealing with a culture that sounds almost identical to our modern influencer culture.
The parallels are honestly striking.
Eh.
Corinth was a wealthy, bustling commercial hub, and the church there had been seduced by a group of false teachers that Paul sarcastically calls the super apostles.
The super apostles, it sounds like a bad superhero movie.
It really does. But these guys were essentially the ancient purveyors of the prosperity gospel. They equated God's favor with health, wealth, visual triumphalism, and incredible public speaking skills. They were polished.
They had the ancient equivalent of the blue check mark.
Exactly. In the Greco-Roman world, to be weak, to suffer publicly, to be sick or impoverished, that was viewed as undeniable proof that the gods were angry with you.
So these super apostles look at Paul, and what do they see? Here's a guy who is battered, bruised, physically unimpressive, constantly chased out of towns, constantly in jail, and they mock him.
Right. They tell the Corinthians, look at this guy's life. It is a total disaster. How can he possibly be an apostle of the living God when he can't even keep himself out of prison?
Now, if I were Paul, my instinct would be to write a letter defending my resume. I would want to project strength, maybe gloss over the sufferings and highlight the miracles. But Paul does the exact opposite.
He really leans into it.
He leans entirely into his absolute helplessness. He writes about this intense affliction he endured in the province of Asia, and he says he despaired even of life. Let's slow down and look at the actual language Paul uses here, because the English translations often smooth over just how terrifying this experience was.
They do. The English makes it sound like you just had a really stressful month at work. But the Greek syntax Paul employs is incredibly heavy.
Walk us through that syntax.
First, he describes the affliction using the verb eberothamen. This comes from a root word that means to be crushed under an overwhelming physical weight. Think of a literal boulder being placed on your chest. You can't expand your lungs, you can't draw breath.
So it is not just a heavy backpack you carry around, it is a weight that is actively suffocating you.
Yes, exactly. And then he qualifies that crushing weight with two compound prepositional phrases. He says it was kath, hyperbolin, meaning exceedingly, beyond measure, and hyperdynamon, which translates to beyond natural ability.
Beyond natural ability.
Right. Paul is explicitly stating that whatever circumstantial nightmare he was facing in Asia completely bypassed his human coping mechanisms. It was mathematically and biologically impossible for him to endure it in his own strength.
He was beyond the outer limits of human endurance. He hit the wall.
And the psychological result of that crushing weight is captured in the word exaporia. Paul says he despaired, but the prefix "eek" makes this a total dead-end despair.
What does that look like practically?
To understand this word, you have to look at how it was used in Hellenistic Greek. It described a traveler who has lost their way in the wilderness, walked down a narrow path, and suddenly finds themselves facing a sheer, unscalable cliff face. And when they turn around, there are predators blocking the path behind them.
There is literally nowhere to go.
Exactly. It is total dead-end bewilderment. There is no strategic way out.
That paints such a vivid picture, but there is another phrase in that passage that is even more intense. Paul mentions having the sentence of death within himself, and the Greek legal term he uses there is apokryma.
Apokryma to thanato. It is a chilling phrase.
When I hear sentence of death, I might think of just a deep internal feeling of doom. Like, I feel like I'm going to die. But an apokryma isn't a feeling, is it?
No, it is not a feeling at all. It is an official, irrevocable judicial verdict handed down by a Roman magistrate.
It is a signed and sealed death warrant.
The trial is over, the verdict is guilty, and the execution is merely pending. Paul looked at his circumstances in Asia and concluded that divine providence had handed him an official death sentence. He had accepted that he was not going to survive.
I need to stop right here, because this raises a massive theological problem for a lot of people.
Oh, absolutely it does.
Why? Why would a loving, perfectly sovereign God hand his most faithful, hard-working apostle an irrevocable judicial death sentence? What is the point of crushing Paul under a boulder he literally cannot lift?
It feels cruel if you look at it through the lens of human comfort. I mean, it goes against everything we want to believe about how God treats his favorites.
Right. It feels like bad management on God's part.
It does. But Paul answers that why question directly with a purpose clause in the very next sentence. He says, in order that we should not trust in ourselves, but in God who raises the dead.
In order that we should not trust in ourselves.
Yes, God permitted a trial that radically exceeded human capacity in order to absolutely prohibit self-trust. Human nature, severely damaged by the fall, has this insidious, deeply rooted tendency toward autonomous strength.
Even for mature believers.
Even mature believers, even the Apostle Paul, who has seen the risen Christ. We can all begin to rely on our own intellect, our past spiritual victories, or our moral discipline.
So it is like the riptide. If the current is only mildly strong, you might successfully swim against it and make it to shore. And if you do, what happens? You stand on the beach and congratulate yourself on how strong of a swimmer you are. You take the glory.
That is exactly the dynamic.
So God permits the riptide to become so violently strong that you physically cannot swim against it anymore. He brings you to the total end of your strength to rip away the mask of self-sufficiency.
If the trial in Asia was something Paul could handle with his impressive Pharisaical intellect or his sheer willpower, he might have quietly taken the credit for surviving it.
He would have written a book about his 5 steps to surviving prison.
Right. But by bringing him to the point of an apocryma, a judicial death sentence, God forces Paul's soul to re-anchor exclusively in the God of resurrection power. Think about it. When you are a corpse, when you are dead, you can't rely on your own strength to get out of the grave. Only God can raise the dead.
This theology isn't just ancient history either. I want to bring in the story of Dr. John Perkins to show what this looks like in the modern era, because it perfectly illustrates how God uses total inability as a staging ground for grace.
Perkins' life is a phenomenal testimony of this.
For those who do not know, John Perkins grew up in the Jim Crow South. He surrenders his life to Christ as an adult, and he has this burning desire to know God through the scriptures. But there is a massive wall in his way.
A huge systemic barrier.
Right. Because of the systemic oppression and poverty he grew up in, he only has a formal education up to the 3rd grade. Imagine the psychological pain of that. He looks at the Bible, he tries to read these complex theological truths, and he is struck with agonizing frustration because he simply cannot comprehend the depth of what he is reading.
He is facing an intellectual apocryma, a complete dead end.
Exactly. And we have to look closely at what Perkins does not do in that moment. He doesn't turn to a pragmatic self-help program. He doesn't try to fake it. He doesn't hide his inability behind empty religious jargon to save face.
He doesn't try to swim harder against the riptide.
Instead, he falls on his face in desperate prayer. He embraces the bankruptcy. He cries out, "Oh God, open up your word to me and I will be faithful to obey it and proclaim it." And God answers that humble, broken cry.
And the result of that answer is just astounding.
It is. God sovereignly opens the scriptures to his mind. Dr. Perkins goes on to have decades of incredibly faithful, culturally transformative gospel ministry. A man who started out with a 3rd grade education ends up authoring numerous books and being awarded 7 honorary doctorates.
The mechanics of grace here are fascinating. God took severe, humiliating human insufficiency and made it the very instrument for massive kingdom impact.
Which makes no sense to the world.
None at all. If Perkins had possessed a PhD in theology from Oxford from the very beginning, he might have relied on his own academic prowess. He might have trusted in his own intellect. But because he had nothing, he had to rely entirely on the illuminating work of the Holy Spirit. His weakness was the required prerequisite for God's power to be displayed.
All right, I track with that when we were talking about external circumstances. God uses physical affliction like Paul's persecution or circumstantial dead ends like Perkins' lack of education to break our self-reliance. But what happens when the threat isn't an external boulder?
That is the real question, isn't it?
Yeah, what happens when the threat is an internal moral collapse? How does God use our internal struggles and temptations? To answer that, I want to pivot to the Old Testament, specifically to King David in Psalm 27, because David gives us a blueprint for handling internal terror.
Psalm 27 brings this theology into a very intimate space. David writes this during a period of acute national and personal crisis. Based on the context, he is likely fleeing for his life from King Saul, who is possessed by jealousy and trying to murder him.
Or he is fleeing the treasonous rebellion of his own son, Absalom.
Right. Either way, David is surrounded by violent adversaries and false witnesses who are breathing out cruelty.
I try to imagine the sensory reality of that. You are the anointed king of Israel, but you are sleeping in dirt caves. You are constantly looking over your shoulder. You don't know which of your friends might betray you for a bounty.
It is ultimate paranoia.
And the stakes aren't just personal, they are covenantal. If David dies in that cave, the Davidic throne is empty. The entire lineage of the promised Messiah is threatened.
The stakes are cosmic. Now, put yourself in the shoes of an ancient Near Eastern king facing a military siege or an internal coup. What is the standard operating procedure?
You call in favors. You hire an army.
Exactly. You rely on carnal alliances. You hire mercenaries, you build taller stone fortresses, or you make diplomatic treaties with neighboring pagan nations. You rely on military pragmatism.
You strategize your way out of the dead end.
Right. But David, who is a brilliant military commander, recognizes his absolute vulnerability. He knows human strategy isn't enough, so he does something completely countercultural. He retreats to the sanctuary of Jehovah.
You can actually see the psychological turmoil and literary structure of the psalm. The first 6 verses are the soaring, triumphant song of confidence. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the strength of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid?
It sounds like he has it all completely together.
It does. But then you hit verse 7, and the tone violently shifts. It is like a theological car crash. He goes from confident soaring to agonizing petition. Hear, O Lord, when I cry with my voice. Have mercy also upon me and answer me. It sounds almost bipolar.
It is an abrupt shift, but it is vital to understand that David doesn't treat this as a contradiction. In the modern church, we think that if we are truly confident in God, we won't ever feel panic.
We treat panic as a lack of faith.
Yes, but David shows us that true biblical confidence is actually anchored in continuous, humble pleading. The panic drives the petition. And verse 8 is the hinge of the entire psalm. It reveals the underlying grammar of seeking God. David writes, "When you said, 'Seek my face,' my heart said to you, 'Your face, Lord, I shall seek.'"
This verse completely changes how I view temptation. Think about a modern car dashboard. You are driving down the highway, and suddenly that red check engine light illuminates. It is a terrifying feeling because it means something is internally broken.
Nobody likes seeing that light.
Nobody? But the light itself is not the problem. The light is an active alarm. It is a mechanism designed by the manufacturer commanding you to pull over and seek a mechanic before the engine explodes.
I like that. The temptation isn't the failure, it is the indicator.
Right. Temptation, that sudden, overwhelming flash of lust or explosive anger or crippling anxiety, is a spiritual check engine light. We usually treat temptation as a sign that we are horrible Christians, and we try to just turn the light off through willpower.
Which is like putting a piece of black tape over the check engine light.
Exactly. You just ignore it until the engine blows.
Yeah.
But what if temptation is an alarm designed to call you to pull over and enter God's presence?
If we look at the Hebrew text of verse 8, it elevates that analogy even further. The command God gives is, "Seek my face." The Hebrew word David chooses for seek is bakwa. This is a highly specific and intentional choice, because he could have used a much more common word, dara.
I am not a Hebrew scholar. Walk me through the difference between those two words on a practical level.
Let's use a modern analogy. Darash frequently means seeking information, consulting an oracle, or intellectually searching out a matter. It is like asking Siri for directions to a restaurant, or Googling the answer to a trivia question. You want a solution.
Okay, so you just want the data.
Right. But bakwa specifically denotes seeking a person's face, seeking their actual presence, their relational audience, is the difference between sending an email to customer service versus demanding an in-person, face-to-face meeting with the CEO of the company.
That is a massive distinction. So when David is in crisis, he isn't just looking for a strategic solution to his Absalom problem, he is seeking the sovereign himself.
Yes, and David uses bakwa in what Hebrew grammar calls the peel stem. The peel stem is used to denote intensive, eager, and highly energetic action.
So it's not passive at all.
Not at all. This is not a casual, sleepy glance toward the heavens before you go to bed. God is fiercely commanding an intensive, energetic pursuit of royal access. In the ancient Near East, to see the face of a monarch meant you were granted official, intimate access to the inner throne room to receive royal favor and protection. It was a matter of life and death.
So let's tie this back to the listener. When the temptation hits, when the riptide grabs you and that check engine light flashes, the Holy Spirit is urgently, intensely commanding you. Get into the throne room now.
Exactly. The distress you feel in the face of temptation is encoded with the divine summons. Persistent temptation is not meant to drive you into hidden sin out of shame.
Which is what we usually do. We hide.
We hide, just like in Eden. Nor is it meant to drive you into spiritual paralysis. It is a direct command from God, inviting you to turn your fleshly vulnerability into kingdom-shattering prayer. When God says, "Seek my face," the regenerated heart immediately echoes, "Your face, Lord, I shall seek."
I love that concept, but I have to play devil's advocate here. David sought God's face, sure. But David was deeply flawed. He sought God imperfectly. He failed plenty of times. Just look at Bathsheba.
He certainly did.
So if I am looking for a perfect blueprint of how to handle crushing temptation, David isn't enough. Where do we see this command to seek God's face in the midst of pressure fulfilled flawlessly?
You are entirely right to point out David's failures. To find the flawless fulfillment, We have to look to the true and better David. We have to look to the ultimate mediator. We have to go to the Garden of Gethsemane in Luke chapter 22.
This is the ultimate pattern of temptation and prayer in the entirety of human history.
Without question. The historical and canonical context of Luke 22 is soaked in redemptive significance. It is the night of the Passover. Jesus has just instituted the new covenant in his blood with the disciples, and he goes out to the Mount of Olives to pray.
The trial he is facing here is monumental. But I think we often misunderstand what Jesus was actually terrified of in the garden. People say he was sweating blood because he was afraid of the physical pain of the crucifixion.
Right, which diminishes the cosmic stakes of what was happening.
Yeah, because history is full of martyrs who went to the cross singing hymns. Jesus wasn't just facing physical death, was he? What exactly is the cup he is begging to pass from him?
To understand the cup, we have to trace that imagery back to the Old Testament prophets, specifically Isaiah 51 and Jeremiah 25. In the prophets, the cup is a terrifying, vivid symbol of the outpoured, undiluted wrath of God against human rebellion.
So it is the wrath of God.
Yes, Jesus is not just recoiling from Roman nails or the physical asphyxiation of a wooden cross. He is facing the incomprehensible judicial burden of becoming the sin-bearing substitute for his people. He is looking into a cup filled with the infinite, holy wrath of a just God.
It is the holy horror of what that would mean for the spotless, eternal Son of God to suddenly bear the filth of human sin and to experience the rupture of fellowship with the Father.
Yes. The psychological and spiritual pressure on him at this moment is infinitely heavier than the physical boulder Paul faced in Asia. It is a weight we cannot fathom.
And it had a physical manifestation, didn't it?
It did. Luke, who was a physician, notes that Jesus was in such agony that his sweat became like great drops of blood falling to the ground, a rare medical condition called hematidrosis, which occurs under extreme, life-threatening psychological stress.
And right in the middle of this nightmare, the text gives us a fascinating detail. Luke says Jesus went to the Mount of Olives, as was his custom.
I'm so glad you brought that up. That 5-word phrase is everything.
Why is that so critical?
Because Jesus' victory in this unprecedented cosmic crisis was anchored in the quiet discipline of his ordinary days. He didn't just suddenly invent a robust prayer life because he realized he was about to be arrested by a mob. Crisis does not create your spiritual habits. Crisis merely reveals the spiritual habits you already have.
That is a stark contrast to the disciples. Jesus brings them to the garden and he explicitly commands them, pray that you may not enter into temptation. He tells them the riptide is coming. And what do? They fall asleep.
They tap out.
They do. But Luke adds this really compassionate yet chilling psychological detail. They fell asleep from sorrow.
It is a devastating detail. Their grief was entirely genuine. Jesus had just spent the evening telling them he was leaving them, that one of their inner circle would betray him, and that Peter, their boldest leader, would deny him. They are psychologically crushed.
But Jesus is exposing a deep human reality here, isn't he? Grief, sorrow, and burnout can become incredibly dangerous temptations to disengage spiritually.
But absolutely. The flesh uses genuine emotional pain to lull us into a state of prayerlessness.
I see this all the time. How does the flesh use that pain, whether it is grief over a loss or clinical burnout or a deep loneliness, to pull us away from prayer?
The flesh does it by turning the soul inward. When we are deeply sorrowful or overwhelmed by life, the flesh whispers a very convincing lie. It says, you are too tired to pray. You've been through too much. You deserve to just numb out.
Go to sleep.
Right. Go to sleep, scroll on your phone for 3 hours, binge watch a show, disengage. The flesh uses the legitimacy of your pain to excuse the neglect of your spiritual vigilance.
But Jesus doesn't coddle that.
Not at all. He tells them, rise and pray. Sorrow demands sleep. Christ commands us to rise.
I want to push back on the outcome of this prayer in Gethsemane because it challenges everything modern culture teaches us about success. The prosperity gospel defines victorious prayer as getting exactly what you want. You name your blessing, you claim it, and God alters reality to deliver it.
Right. God is a cosmic vending machine.
Exactly. But look at Jesus in Gethsemane. He prays, Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me. He explicitly asks for the cup to pass, and it didn't pass. He still got arrested, he still got beaten, and he still went to the cross. So by modern, pragmatic standards, Jesus' prayer was a total failure. He didn't get what he asked for. How on earth can we call this victorious prayer?
That is perhaps the most vital theological question we can ask. Because if victorious prayer means manipulating divine providence to avoid suffering, then Gethsemane is an unmitigated failure. But we have to redefine victory.
What is the biblical definition of victory then?
Victory is not controlling God. Victory is the submission of honest human desire to the sovereign will of the Father. Notice the second half of Jesus' prayer. He says, "Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done."
Not my will, but yours. That is the hinge.
Right. Jesus had a true, complete human nature, including a human will. And as a human, he naturally and wholly recoils from death and divine wrath. His desire to avoid the cup was not sinful. It was the proper response of a holy being to the horror of wrath.
So it wasn't wrong for him to ask for an alternative.
No, not at all. But the active, agonizing submission of his human will to the Father's eternal redemptive purpose, that is the essence of victory. True biblical prayer does not strengthen us to escape the trial. It strengthens us to obey God straight through the trial.
Wow.
Think about it. God sends an angel to strengthen Jesus in the garden. But notice, the angel doesn't strengthen him so he can run away to Egypt. The angel strengthens him so he can stand up, walk directly toward Judas, and go to the cross.
So victorious prayer is praying until you submit yourself to God's will, not praying until circumstances submit to your will.
Precisely. The goal of prayer is alignment with sovereignty, not the manipulation of sovereignty.
That is a profound distinction, but I know what a listener might be thinking right now. They might hear this and say, okay, that is beautiful theology. It is great for Jesus. He is the sinless, incarnate Son of God. Of course, he perfectly submitted. But I am not perfect.
Right.
In fact, I have already failed my temptations miserably.
They already fell asleep in the garden argument.
Yes. What if I didn't pray and I already caved to the sin?
That is where the theology of grace over performance becomes our ultimate comfort. We have to transition back to the Old Testament, to Genesis chapter 20, to see how God uses the failing intercessor. Because if God only used perfect people, heaven would be empty.
The story of Abraham and Gerar. This is one of those biblical narratives that is almost uncomfortably honest. It is the kind of story a PR firm would have edited out of the Bible.
It is shockingly raw. God does not sanitize the heroes of the faith.
Set the stage for us. Abraham is the father of faith. He has received the covenant promises. And right after the promised child, Isaac, is finally supposed to be born, Abraham travels to the region of Gerar, and he succumbs to the exact same temptation of fear that he had failed 20 years earlier in Egypt.
It is a total moral regression.
He looks at the pagan king, Abimelech, and he panics.
Yeah?
He lies and says his wife Sarah is just his sister, hoping Abimelech won't kill him to take her. He completely compromises his integrity, he puts his wife in extreme moral danger, and he risks the purity of the entire covenantal lineage right before the promised seed is born.
It is a staggering moral failure. He acts out of pure, cowardly self-preservation. It is the exact opposite of trusting God.
And the mess he creates is catastrophic. God strikes Abimelech's household with a plague of infertility because Abimelech took Sarah into his harem. So here we have a massive disaster, entirely caused by the sin and cowardice of the believer.
It is entirely Abraham's fault.
But then comes the plot twist that absolutely blows my mind. God intervenes in a dream to stop Abimelech from touching Sarah. And God tells this pagan king something that makes zero logical sense. God says, "Now then, return the man's wife, for he is a prophet, so that he will pray for you and you shall live." Hold on, think about this. God tells the victim of the lie that he needs the liar to pray for him.
It defies all human logic regarding merit and worthiness.
This is like a soccer coach watching his star player purposefully score an own goal for the other team, completely sabotaging the game, and the coach immediately subs that same player back in to take the game-winning penalty kick. Why would a holy God use a failing, cowardly servant who literally just caused the mess to be the exclusive conduit for healing?
Because it highlights the absolute, unassailable sovereignty of divine electing grace. Moses, under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, intentionally placed this ugly story right before the miraculous birth of Isaac in Genesis 21 to prove a theological point to Israel.
Which is what?
That Abraham is not chosen, and he's not used by God because of his flawless moral performance. He's used solely because of God's unmerited covenant mercy. God's purposes are not thwarted by our failures. God delights in using restored, humbled sinners to execute his intercessory work on earth.
Let's dig into the mechanics of that restoration. How does the text describe Abraham's prayer for Abimelech?
Let's look at the specific Hebrew verbs used in Genesis 20.16. It says Abraham prayed for Abimelech. The verb for prayed is weyipalal, which is situated in the hitpail stem. It comes from the root word palal.
Okay, we talked about the peel stem earlier. What does the hitpail stem add to our understanding here?
The hitpail stem denotes reflexive, intensive intercession. It implies a deep internal participation in the action. Abraham didn't just offer a quick, embarrassed apology. He didn't just say, "Hey man, sorry about the lie, hope you feel better."
He didn't just passively hope God would fix it.
No, he stepped fully into his ordained prophetic role and poured out his soul as an official intercessor, intensely and reflexively pleading for the life of the pagan king he had just severely wronged. He threw himself into the gap. And in response to that prayer, the text says God Wayirpa. He sovereignly healed Abimelech and the women of his household.
So God undoes the biological and circumstantial damage of human sin through the prayers of the very sinner who was just restored. That is staggering.
It is the ultimate proof of grace. In the ancient Near East, sickness and plagues were viewed as irreversible curses from unpredictable gods. But Jehovah demonstrates that true prayer, even when it comes from the lips of a flawed, stumbling, but restored believer, moves the hand of the sovereign God to bring healing and restoration.
That is a massive encouragement for anyone listening who feels disqualified by their past.
The listener needs to hear this deeply. Your past failures, your cowardly lies, your lapses into temptation, they do not disqualify you from accessing the throne of grace. If you have fallen to temptation this week, repent, accept the forgiveness bought by Christ, stand back up, and step right back into your role as an intercessor. Christ's perfect performance covers your imperfect performance.
Okay, this is where the rubber meets the road. We have established a theological foundation of Christ's perfection in Gethsemane. We have the historical proof from Abraham that God uses restored failures. So how do we actually execute this in our daily lives? What is the practical strategy of spiritual warfare? How do we take these impulses and weaponize them?
The source material introduces a brilliant pastoral concept called the Thrasher strategy, named after the theologian Bill Thrasher. The core idea is incredibly practical, yet profoundly spiritual. You intentionally attach a specific scripture-shaped intercession to your recurring temptations. You pre-program a prayer reflex.
I love this concept. I like to think of it as spiritual judo.
Spiritual judo. Explain that.
In the martial art of judo, the fundamental principle is that you do not meet your opponent's force head-on with your own force. If a 250-pound guy rushes at you and you just stand there rigidly trying to hold him back with your arms, you are going to get steamrolled.
You're going to get flattened.
Exactly. And that is what we do spiritually. That is practical Pelagianism, trying to face sin with sheer human willpower.
And as we established with Paul in Asia, relying on your own willpower against a supernatural enemy always leads to exhaustion and despair.
Right. But in judo, when the opponent rushes you, you step slightly to the side, you grab their momentum, and you redirect their own force to throw them to the mat. You use the enemy's energy against them. So instead of just gritting your teeth and trying to suppress a temptation, you redirect its energy. You use the trigger of the temptation to do massive damage to the enemy's own kingdom.
That is a phenomenal way to visualize it. Let's walk through some highly specific modern scenarios of how a listener can actually practice this reflex. Let's start with a common one. A believer is dealing with recurring temptations toward impure thoughts or lust.
Okay, the check engine light flashes. The temptation hits. What is the judo move?
The natural fleshly instinct is to just try to stop thinking about it.
Yeah.
Tell yourself, don't think about that image, which psychologically usually guarantees you will think about it more.
Oh, always. If I tell you not to think of a pink elephant, what are you thinking of?
A pink elephant. Yeah. Exactly. The judo move is to immediately use that flash of temptation as a trigger to pray fervently for the holy purity of your children, your spouse, or the teenagers in your local church youth group. You take the fiery dart that Satan aimed at your mind and you turn it into an intercessory shield for the next generation.
That is brilliant. Think about the strategic loss for the enemy. Satan attacks you with a moment of lust, hoping to drag you into shame. But because you have pre-programmed this reflex, the result of his attack is that 3 teenagers in your church just got a hedge of protection prayed around their purity. The enemy literally loses ground every time he attacks you. He regrets aiming the dart at you.
It completely disrupts the economy of spiritual warfare. Let's try another one. What about envy or resentment? You log on to social media and you see someone get the promotion you've been working for, or they buy the house you want, or they get the public recognition you feel you deserve. The immediate temptation is to harbor bitterness and critique them in your mind.
The judo move here is incredibly convicting. Use that exact trigger of jealousy to thank God for the gifts he has given to that specific person, and you pray for their continued fruitfulness and success.
Yes. You pray a genuine blessing over the very person your flesh wants to resent. It completely short-circuits the temptation. Envy always narrows your world until the forbidden object feels ultimate and you become totally self-absorbed.
You just get stuck in a mirror.
Intercession shatters that mirror. It widens your horizon back out to the expansiveness of God's kingdom.
Let's do one more. What about fear or discouragement? I know so many people who are just paralyzed by anxiety right now. Anxiety about the future, the political culture, their finances, their health.
When that tightening in your chest happens, when the panic surges, use it as a trigger. Don't just pray, God, take my anxiety away. Pray for the courage and spiritual empowerment of persecuted believers around the world.
Redirect the focus.
Yes. Pray for believers in underground churches facing real physical danger. Pray for your pastors and missionaries. By praying for their boldness in the face of literal persecution, your own circumstantial fear shrinks in the light of intercession.
I want to ground this in reality because the essays provided a historical proof of this strategy that is absolutely staggering. It is the true story of a woman named Dorothy Clapp.
This is one of the greatest hidden testimonies of the 20th century.
It really is. Dorothy Clapp was an elderly woman living in New Jersey in the 1940s and 50s. She wasn't a famous theologian. She didn't have a massive platform. She wasn't writing best-selling books. She was just an ordinary believer. But God laid a profound, agonizing burden on her heart for the public high school right down the street from her house.
A burden that probably felt like a temptation to despair at times.
I am sure it did. And for 15 years, she prayed continuously for the students at Ramsey High School.
Let's pause and consider the sheer grit of that. 15 years of seemingly invisible prayer. Most of us give up praying for something if God doesn't answer within 15 days.
Exactly. She took her distress over the lost youth in her town, and she turned it into relentless intercession. She didn't see any immediate fruit. But after 12 years of doing this, she zeroes in on one specific, mischievous, difficult male student. She starts praying for him daily by name, and eventually she manages to give him a Gospel of John.
And we know who that student was.
We do. That high school student was a young man named George Verwer.
For listeners who know mission history, the name George Verwer is legendary.
Yes. God answers Dorothy's decades of hidden prayers. George Verwer reads the gospel, attends a Billy Graham crusade, and gets radically saved. He goes to college, starts handing out gospels in Mexico, and eventually founds Operation Mobilization, or OM.
And OM goes on to become one of the most massive global missionary movements in modern history. They launched gospel ships, literal ocean liners like the Logos Hope, that sail to coastal ports all over the world. They have mobilized tens of thousands of young people into missions. They have distributed literally hundreds of millions of Bibles and Christian books globally.
And if you trace the lineage of all that massive kingdom-damaging victory, every Bible handed out, every soul saved on those ships, it traces all the way back to the quiet living room of one humble, elderly woman in New Jersey who decided to turn her burden into faithful, relentless intercession.
She didn't have a global platform, but her prayers birthed one. That is the unimaginable power of a single believer weaponizing their spiritual distress.
That narrative provides the ultimate theological comfort that wraps up this entire deep dive. It proves a universal principle in God's economy,
Which is that God always wins his greatest victories out of apparent defeat.
The sources connect this principle all the way to the end of time, pointing us to the eschatological vision in Revelation chapter 11.
Yes, the Apostle John's vision of the two witnesses during the tribulation. These two prophets are empowered by God to preach and perform miracles. But then, mysteriously, God sovereignly permits the beasts from the abyss to overcome them and slay them right in the streets of Jerusalem.
And for 3.5 days, the pagan world throws a party. They celebrate the death of the witnesses. It looks like total, undeniable defeat. The church's greatest champions are dead in the street.
But at the exact moment of ultimate apparent defeat, when the enemy thinks he's completely won a language, God breathes the breath of life back into their corpses. They stand up on their feet. They are resurrected into heaven in a cloud. A massive earthquake strikes the city, and their enemies are utterly terrified, ultimately giving glory to the God of heaven.
It is the exact same pattern we see in the cross and the resurrection. Friday afternoon looks like the ultimate triumph of evil. The Messiah is dead, the Romans won, the Pharisees won. But Sunday morning proves that God was simply using the apparent defeat of the tomb as the staging ground for cosmic victory.
And that is the synthesis for you, the listener. Your moments of deepest weakness, your crushing circumstantial trials, the internal temptations that make you feel like you were drowning in a riptide, they are not the end of your story. If you are in Christ, they are simply the staging ground for divine triumph.
So this is the call to action for everyone listening. Stop fighting the riptide in your own strength. Reject your self-reliance. Confess your prayerlessness. If you have been relying on psychological hacks or secular therapy or sheer willpower to fight your secret sins, repent of your practical atheism today.
Let every single flash of temptation, every moment of anxiety, every pang of lust or anger be a loud ringing bell calling you directly into the throne room of grace.
And when you enter that throne room, trust completely in your perfect high priest, Jesus Christ. He didn't just model this for you as an example. He obeyed perfectly in your place.
He died for your failures in the garden and your lies in Gerar. And right now, he lives to intercede for you. Your imperfect prayers are cleansed by his blood before they ever reach the Father's ears.
We've talked a lot today about redirecting your temptations into prayers for others, doing that spiritual judo. But I want to leave you with a final thought to ponder a provocative idea that builds on everything we've explored today.
This is a powerful thought to end on.
We know from Scripture that God wastes absolutely nothing. Not your pain, not your failures, and certainly not your struggles. So think about this. What if the specific, recurring temptation that you hate the most about yourself, the one you constantly beg God to take away, the one that causes you the most tears, is actually a precise indicator of the exact area where God intends to use you to build his kingdom most powerfully?
A map to your future ministry.
Exactly. What if your area of greatest vulnerability isn't just a weakness to be managed, but a map to your future ministry? If you learn to stop fighting in your own strengths and let the riptide of that temptation carry you straight into the arms of the sovereign God, who knows what massive kingdom victories he might achieve through your surrender?
Keep seeking his face.
Keep seeking his face. We will catch you next time on Reformed Thinking.